when we think about climate as a challenge in risk management, it's important to recognize that it's embedded in a matrix. The risk emerges really from the overlap of three kinds of factors. One factor is the hazard that comes from climate. You can think of this as the physical triggers, but the physical triggers alone aren't enough to cause impacts. You get impacts from the overlap of the hazard, along with vulnerability, who's susceptible to damage and why, and exposure, what kind of assets are at risk. And it's from this overlap that the true risks of climate change emerge. It's also really important to recognize that we have a wide range of drivers, not only of options for changing the triggers, but for changing vulnerability and exposure. Vulnerability and exposure are essentially consequences of social and economic processes over which we have a lot of control, and some of those control mechanisms are in the domain of adaptation. Others are the normal progress of development, and we need to think carefully about the way development interacts with adaptation in order to shape vulnerability and exposure. Vulnerability and exposure can be increased by development, or they can be decreased. The fact that the opportunities are in our hands really transitions the issue of climate as a challenge in risk management to one from understanding the problem space, which you can think of as mapped here, to understanding the solution space, which I'll gradually transition to through my remarks today. I want to run through a series of the conclusions of the Working Group 2 report. The first conclusion is one that I think is widely understood, but it's really important. It's that the impacts of climate changes that have already been observed are widespread, consequential. We've seen impacts from the equators to the poles, from the coasts to the mountains around the world. It's very different than the conclusion in the fourth assessment report, where it was highly likely that there were some kind of impacts somewhere. The figure here iconically represents where impacts have been attributed with some level of confidence in physical, biological, or human systems. Many of the impacts that have been attributed in physical systems involve the cryosphere, ice, water, heat waves, and around the world. You can see the places where they've been attributed, you can see the level of confidence, and you can see whether or not climate change is inferred to have played a major or a minor role. In biological systems, many of the impacts are on crop yields, many of the impacts are on timing of biological processes, some of the impacts are on wildfires. Again, evidence of impacts attributed to climate change around the world. And in human systems, we see the same thing: impacts on transportation, impacts on human health, impacts on human security, impacts attributed around the world, a very different environment than the environment that we were in even a few years ago, where the level of knowledge really wasn't sufficient to make this kind of conclusion. Here's an example of a specific impact that's really well documented. This is the consequences of climate changes over the last few years on yield trends in 4 of the world's major food crops: wheat, rice, maize, and soy. And what you can see is that at least for wheat and maize, there have already been impacts where the climate changes that have occurred to date have slowed increases in yield, such that for wheat, about 2% per decade less yield increases than we would have seen in the absence of climate change, and for maize, about 1% per decade less increases in yield than we would have seen in the absence of climate change. Really clear evidence of an attributed impact where climate change is making it more and more difficult to advance societal goals of food security. One of the key things that we need to tackle in Working Group 2 is vulnerability, and it's obviously a major concern around the world. And we know that many aspects of poverty, ethnicity, race, gender, other kinds of inequality really enhance vulnerability and make it a much more difficult problem. But what we see looking around the world is that vulnerability isn't just concentrated in pockets where these factors come together in unfortunate circumstances. What we really see is that there are pockets of vulnerability around the world, and that rich countries aren't protected from impacts of climate change either. In fact, in many cases, what we see in the rich world is that the vulnerability is a consequence of hubris rather than of the kinds of conditions that cause vulnerability in most settings. settings. And if you look at, for example, the impacts of Hurricane Sandy on New York City, what you see is a shocking example of lack of preparation in a way that, even though the climate changes didn't result, the climate impact of the hurricane didn't result in large amounts of excess deaths, it resulted in massive economic losses. And you really get a picture of the way that vulnerability plays out in different ways in different places around the world. We've already talked in this meeting quite a lot about the need to transition to a focus on a balance between understanding climate, understanding options for adaptation, and understanding options for mitigation. One of the striking things we concluded in the Working Group 2 report is that there are already lots and lots of examples of how climate change adaptation is moving from the academic planning stages into real implementation. And you see a wide range of adaptation projects where we're already beginning to learn from experience with them, all the way from this kind of major engineering project in the port at Rotterdam to much more community-based projects like the mangrove planting here in Tuvalu. Adaptation is no longer just an academic topic. It's a topic where we have real-world experience allowing us to build real-world critiques of things that are actually being done. And you see examples of adaptation around the world. It's not just a few places. Here's examples in the Americas, in Europe and Africa, in Asia and Australia. Examples around the world of real things that represent a foundation on which the agenda of this community is going to be to build in the future. But we need to, because it's really clear, and probably the most stark conclusion from the Working Group 2 report is that with increased warming, we see an increased risk of impacts that are pervasive, severe, and irreversible. Now let's just look at a little bit of that climate data to get a feel for this. It's a map of the warming that's occurred over the last century. It's a little less than 1°C at the global average, with an amplification near the poles. If you look forward, it's really striking how much the difference is from this pattern. With the same color scale, you can see the map of a world with ambitious mitigation in the lower left and with continued high emissions in the lower right. The plume plot in the top shows the trajectory of global average temperatures over the last century and the trajectory of possible future temperatures with continued high emissions in the upper plume and with ambitious mitigation in the lower plume. I want to point out two things about the plumes. The first is that for the next few decades, you can think about it as the era of near-term committed climate change, where you see the white arrows. Trajectories don't differ dramatically as a consequence of level of investment in mitigation. What that means is that the climate changes we'll encounter from now until essentially mid-century are already baked into the system as a consequence not only of the physics of the climate system and the way that inertia drives continued changes, but also of the inertia in social and economic systems where deployed infrastructure will continue to utilize carbon and emit heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere as a consequence of existing infrastructure for energy generation, for buildings, and for transportation. But if you look at the end of the century with the second wide arrow, dramatic consequences of investment in mitigation, such that that really is an era of climate choice, where investments in mitigation during the next few decades really determine whether or not we are on the blue plume with a world that looks pretty much like the world of the present, or the red plume where essentially all bets are off. And you can see that by comparing the climate changes that have already occurred with the projected changes shown here with the same color scale. And what you can see is that on a trajectory toward a 2°C world, we're looking at about as much change as we've already seen. And on a trajectory for a 4°C world, we're looking at essentially everything being different. A world that is really hard to imagine, it's hard to model, and it's hard to conceive of the kinds of strategies that would let us deal effectively with climate changes at that magnitude. Let me introduce you to a tool that Working Group 2 has been utilizing to think about how to characterize risk moving forward. And the idea is that we can think about 4 very different worlds. We have the world of the present, where we're already seeing investments in adaptation, but we're seeing unmet needs for adaptation. We can think about the world over the next few decades, where the climate changes we encounter are largely independent of the ambition of the investments in mitigation. And we can think about 2 alternative worlds at the end of the 21st century, one a world with continued high emissions, and the second a world with ambitious investment in mitigation, such that we end the century at something like 2C over pre-industrial. And in this representation of those 4 worlds, you can see the present level of risk. You can see the level to which the risk can be reduced as a result of ambitious investments in adaptation. And you can see the contrast, how much the risk is reduced by investment in mitigation, by comparing the bottom 2 bars. And if we go around the world, what you can see is that for key risks in each of the world's regions, there are opportunities for adaptation now. There are risks that we're committed to seeing increase in the future, and there are risks that can be avoided through ambitious investments in mitigation. Around the world, the key risk areas are different, and the opportunities for solutions are different. But there's no doubt about 2 things. 1, there are opportunities for adaptation and requirements for adaptation, and 2, that the opportunities for successful adaptation are much, much, much richer in a world with ambitious investment in mitigation. I want to close with some thoughts about how we characterize the world of the future. And the big problem we face in understanding impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability is that there are thousands of sectors and millions of different kinds of interactions that are potentially a concern. And ideally, we'd like to have some way to bundle those into buckets of issues. And in Working Group 2, we've tried to do this by identifying 5 different buckets of issues, major areas of concern that really capitalize not only on issues that really make a difference, but issues that need to be evaluated with very different approaches. Need to be evaluated with approaches that depend on the ethics, the priorities and the values that individuals bring, and values that in some cases are quite difficult to express in monetary terms. At the left hand, you can see risk to rare and unique systems. These are things like biological diversity or historical or archaeological resources. The second column is risks of extremes. We already talked about how most of the climate change impacts are packaged in extremes. And you can see for these 2, we're already detecting an increase in risks as a result of impacts that have already occurred to date. The third bar is the distribution of impacts, the kind of unfairness factor, how in most cases the likelihood of impacts is much greater for groups that didn't contribute anything to causing the problem, and in many cases have the least resources for dealing with them. The fourth column is the one people typically think about, global aggregate impacts on the world economy, food supply, water supply, total biodiversity. And that's not unimportant, but it's only one of the 5 major reasons for concern. And then the 5th bar is large-scale singular events, risks of things like collapse of a major continental ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, and the consequences of that for committing future generations to a sea level rise, which in the case of the Greenland ice sheet is about 7 meters, about 23 feet of sea level rise. And it's only by looking across all these different kinds of reasons for concern can different stakeholder groups in different parts of the world bring their own values and priorities to the problem, and finding a way to open the conversation such that priorities, values, and ethics can be included from the ground up, that we're going to be able to move forward successfully with this problem. Let me close with 2 thoughts. The first is that we tend to formulate the problem of dealing with climate change as one about what we're going to give up in order to solve the climate problem. But I think the analysis is now indicating that it's not really a question of what we're going to give up. It's a question of how we're going to put together different pieces of the puzzle in order to build a solution space that works better for everyone. The way I think about it is that the goal of dealing with climate change is not figuring out what we're going to give up. It's figuring out how we're smarter to build a world that continues to have robust economies and vibrant communities. And let me just close with a picture of what I consider the solution space. You're going to say, I said this was the problem space at the first, but embedded in it are the keys to the solutions. There are solutions in dealing with emissions, especially with renewable energy and efficiency. There are options for dealing with, I can't see any of the slides, so I'm going to make this up as I go along, but there are options for dealing with vulnerability and exposure. There are options for dealing with risk. And there are many options for being smart about the way that we pursue economic development and governance. The real key that I want to leave you with is that when you put all these pieces together, we have all the elements of the puzzle. We have the map of the solution space, we have the map of the problem space, and we now understand that climate change is fundamentally, at its core, a challenge in managing risks. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. The next presentation is by Diane Lieberman from University of Arizona, Climate Adaptation, New Assessments and Next Steps.
Thank you very much. So good morning. I'm going to talk about two things this morning. First of all, my slide could come up, please. First of all, I'm going to talk about the US National Climate Assessment, which became public just a few days ago. And this, I think, will be the first international presentation of that assessment. And I hope it's relevant beyond the US, both as an example of how to do assessment, or perhaps not, but also some of the comments I'm going to make about its limitations. And what I'm going to talk about in particular, both in relation to IPCC Working Group 2 and the US National Climate Assessment, are a couple of critical gaps in understanding. The first is the degree to which we can understand local impacts in a global context, and the second is the need for us to focus more broadly on overlooked sectors of the economy and the places that people work. So the third US National Climate Assessment was released last Tuesday. It was led by my colleague Kathy Jacobs, who sends her greetings to all her friends here, and thank you. And this is a picture of Kathy at the White House. I'm a member, along with Mark Howden, who's here, of the Federal Advisory Committee that wrote the report. I authored the Research Agenda chapter and contributed to the Agricultural and Southwest US chapters. I think that we were pretty lucky with our timing of the release of the report. It happened to be a slow news day, but we also benefited from, I think, an unprecedented orchestration of communications. And we engaged a skilled group of climate communicators, and also a lot of NGOs and consulting firms volunteered their time to spread the news about the report. There were more than 2,000 news articles about the report in the first week. The report featured on the evening news in 4 of the major news outlets, not Fox News, but most of the others. The webpage had 165,000 hits in the first 24 hours. And perhaps most important, President Obama spent the whole day talking about the report with some of the best-known newscasters from around the nation. So far, so good. I don't know how much impact it's had on the infamous American attitudes to climate change and whether it changed the mind of any of the skeptics, but I think most of us were really happy with how much attention it got. We all organized local events as well, and we had a really good turnout in Tucson of community members. So the report was co-authored by more than 300 scientists from universities, government, the private sector, NGOs, and think tanks. It was really co-produced by a lot of different actors. It was intensely peer-reviewed, and it's become an official publication of the US Global Change Research Program under the Global Change Research Act, which was passed in 1990. And this is about a dozen federal agencies. The National Climate Assessment is one of the requirements of the US Global Change Research Act, which requires an assessment every 4 years that synthesizes the science of global change, discusses the impacts of global change in a number of socioeconomic sectors, analyzes trends in global change for the next 25 to 100 years. Now, it's sort of like the IPCC in that sense, but actually we've only had 3 reports. This is the 3rd report since 1990. In addition to the full report that I'll give you a preview of, and it's hundreds of pages, it's available digitally, and one of the things that we've done is link everything to the data and to the sources, so it's an interactive report. There's also a website which has highlights. There's a lot of high-resolution graphics that I'll show you. And then, at the recommendation of our climate communicators, we've produced a lot of shorter reports, a highlights document, regional summaries that are 2 pages each, a summary of the report findings, and so on. And those all became available at once. Late in the process, we realized that it would be quite helpful to publish the summaries of the report in Spanish for the very large percentage of the US population who prefer to speak Spanish in their homes, and also perhaps to share the results more broadly with our neighbors in Latin America. So the federal government didn't have the resources to do that, so I'm proud that my university stepped up to commission the translations. And if you're interested in downloading the Spanish versions of the reports, the website is there. It's not on the federal webpage yet because I think it has to go through a million hoops before it can become officially the federal document, but it is available. And my local congressman is organizing a number of events for the Hispanic caucus. This is the website for the actual report, the web link, and many people have commented on the effectiveness of the web presentation of the site. And those of you who know anything about US politics, excuse me, know that the US government got into a lot of trouble about their website on healthcare reform, and people have pointed out that the government has finally created a website that works. Excuse me. I'll give you a minute to read the key messages while I clear my throat. So, what does the report say and how is it different? Here are the 4 messages that we sought to prioritize in communication. The big focus was to convince or to share with the American public and the world that climate change is already happening, that it's happening now, and that people are already experiencing the impacts. So a large amount of the report is documenting that climate change is already occurring. It also tries to show the opportunities that there are to reduce the risks through mitigation and adaptation, but we don't use the mitigation and adaptation words based on understanding climate communication. We talk about managing what is causing climate change and preparing for its effects. And then another thing that we focus on is that climate change is just one of the risks that many decision makers are facing. And I think one of the things that's different compared to the last assessment is this focus on climate change is happening now, and on the fact that the risks are now more serious and we're more confident about them, partly based on IPCC. So the sectors that are covered in the report, and most of these are required by the Global Change Research Act, as shown here: water, transport, agriculture, forestry, ecosystems, and biodiversity. And I'll come back to that because you'll notice that there isn't anything on the economy on that list. There were 8 regions drawn along state boundaries, and in addition to the regions, there were chapters on coasts and on oceans, sort of some of the common biogeographical areas. Another innovation was that we decided to do cross-cutting chapters. This again has a little bit of a mirror of IPCC Working Group 2. One of the ones that has received a lot of attention in my region is the chapter on Indigenous peoples and their experience of climate change and how they're adapting to it. And I would say that every single one of these chapters has a section on adaptation, But we also have a series of chapters specifically on responses to climate change, where we look at mitigation options and specifically at adaptation. One of the criticisms we've received is that there's only one chapter on mitigation, and we could talk about that because compared to a whole report for IPCC Working Group 3, that is not a lot of attention to mitigation. The report does have a set of powerful graphics, and if you look at the media coverage, it's quite interesting. We got lots of reports like 15 arresting images of climate change, 14 compelling graphics, and there was one more informal blog that says that had 10 graphics to scare the S out of you. So there was a big focus on the graphics and how powerful they are. So let me show you a few of those graphics. So this is the climate change is already happening map. And this is changes in US temperature that have been observed since 1900. And basically all across the US, the last 3 or 4 decades have been each warmer than the one before. And you can see that in parts of the US, we've definitely gone above the 1 to 1.5. And I apologize for the international audience, but in order to communicate to the US public, it has to all be in Fahrenheit. We learned that lesson about 5 years ago, I think, having tried to communicate the risks and realizing people didn't think they were important because 2 degrees Fahrenheit isn't much warmer. So, whereas 2 degrees centigrade, of course, is. Another graphic are observed changes in precipitation. And this is, I think, new. We've all seen those maps of the temperature increases. But here you can see some fairly consistent changes in precipitation across the US, particularly changes that include quite serious drying in the southwestern US, northern Rockies, and the southeast, and much wetter conditions elsewhere. And remember, this is all observations. Another graphic that's received quite a lot of attention is a graphic that was put together about changes in extreme weather. And this is observed change in something defined as very heavy precipitation. And you can see here a 71% increase in the northeastern United States, less in the West, and also in the upper Midwest, a 37% increase in extreme events. And we hope that these sorts of maps will convince the American public that something is happening and we need to do something about it. Here's another one. This is the increase in the frost-free season. Now, this is, of course, is important for agriculture, and across the northern US could be perceived as a very positive change. But it's also relevant to pests and insects, which are killed off during the winter season. And what you can see here is that in the western United States, we've had an increase of more than 15 days in the frost-free period. In the eastern United States, it's slightly less. This, as I said, creates some opportunities for agriculture and for reduced heating costs in the northern US, but has more serious implications for pests and disease. Then there were a series of graphics about sea level rise, and the one that was reported in particular was the observed sea level rise along the eastern coast of the United States, where in Philadelphia, sea level has increased by more than a foot over the past century. And this, of course, is linked to the sort of risks to urban infrastructure that Chris showed when he mentioned Hurricane Sandy. Another graphic are the trends in flood magnitude, and here you can see the value of some geographic detail in the assessment. These are trends in river flooding across the United States, where you can see the reflection of that change in precipitation with reduced flooding in the west and increased flooding, particularly in the upper Midwest. There is quite a lot of information on changes in ecosystems in the report. I'll just show you one example here, which is the shift in fisheries, which might not look as significant as you might think, except for lobsters moving towards Canada. I understand that the lobsters here are pretty good. Mark Howden told me he ate 3 the other day, but there has been a shift northward in fisheries. Then, of course, there is the documented impacts on infrastructure across the US, where it's being damaged both by sea level rise, heavy downpours, and extreme heat. And those are documented particularly in the regional chapters with very dramatic impacts in places like Alaska, where warming is really disrupting the permafrost and infrastructure. And then another one that got a lot of impacts, and I think this is interesting as to how one picks what to put into this type of assessment. Another thing that got quite a lot of attention is that the US assessment documents some changes that affect pollen and people's allergic reaction. The allergy season, particularly for ragweed, has extended by as much as 27 days. And for any of you who have allergies to ragweed or similar pollen, you know that that means another month of misery, and that was reported. In terms of future climate, like the IPCC, we document a lot in terms of the low-end scenarios and the high-end scenarios of what might happen with climate change. This is the US version, I think, of Chris's graphic, which shows that with higher emissions, we're going to get warming of 7 or 8 degrees or above Fahrenheit in the United States, with all sorts of serious implications. Again, slightly newer, and these are from CMIP5 and NARCAP. You can see the projected changes in precipitation with a wetter northern United States and a much drier southwest. One of the things about this report in terms of where I live in Tucson is we clearly are a hot spot in terms of both warming and drying. The sea level rise projections from our report received a lot of attention. It's showing that we've already got a foot of sea level rise, but the projection shows 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, with the possibility of more than 6 feet at the higher end of estimates. I'll whiz through, I'll miss that one, it's complicated, but basically showing changes in snowpack. This is a graphic that shows how we've tried to look at climate change in the context of multiple stresses. The map on the left are increases in water demand that would occur without climate change, just from changes in population and consumption over the next period of time. This is up to 2060. But you can see how climate change increases that water demand, so that then you're starting to see 25% increases in water demand in areas where there are already limited water resources through the combination of both demand and then supply changes associated with climate change. There's quite a lot of graphics related to agriculture, and this is a set of agroclimatic graphics. There's the change in frost-free season. This is with more detail. There are the change in the number of frost days, the change in number of consecutive dry days, and the change in the number of hot nights. And for those of you in agrometeorology, with all of those showing shifts towards hotter, drier conditions, you can imagine the impacts that that would have on agriculture across the southern US. But again, think about the positive impacts for agriculture across the northern US. And then finally, in terms of future projections, again, the health impacts, I think, is an area we all should focus on, because it really does draw public and policymakers' attention. And another major risk in the US is the spread of tick-borne fever. And this shows the increase in tick habitat that will occur by 2080 as a result of the projected climate changes. And you can see that the probability of tick establishment increases across a much larger area. I mentioned the chapter on indigenous peoples, and there that focuses in particular on vulnerability and on changes to their way of life. The native nations of the US are poorer than most other groups in the population. They have poorly insulated houses. They don't have access to cooling. And it affects both their traditional crops, and then in Alaska, we've just heard that another village will be relocating because climate change has already occurred. In terms of adaptation, the report talks about, throughout the report, there is discussion of adaptation that's already occurring and which could occur. But the report concludes that even though there's a lot of planning going on in the US, there isn't much implementation. And even the implementation that is happening is insufficient to prevent a lot of negative changes. And I won't go through this in detail. I would refer you to the adaptation chapter. The key message includes that substantial adaptation planning is occurring but isn't being implemented. It talks about the barriers to adaptation, including the legal ones, showing that laws need to be changed, for example, related to water. It talks about vulnerability being exacerbated by other stresses so that you can adapt by reducing those stresses as much as adapting to climate. And then one of the very important conclusions is that we haven't done enough to assess the effectiveness of adaptation. And I know we're going to be talking about that this week. So I just wanted to end by talking about some of the gaps that I perceive. Now I'm taking off my promoting the NCA hat and I'm putting on my criticizing the NCA hat. And there were two things that I struggled with as an author and that I think we're going to have to deal with in future assessments. The first is that I don't think we did a good job of looking at local impacts in the international context. We didn't do a good job at looking at a lot of the economy, and that's why we need a sustained assessment process. So briefly, why am I worried about our lack of study in climate impacts or climate adaptation in an international context? It's because for most of the US, and in fact most parts of the world, at least a third of key goods are traded and are not produced nationally or locally. And what this means is that most of us are vulnerable to climate changes in other places. And the US National Assessment looks mostly at the US as if it existed in isolation. I know the US can be isolationist, but from a scientific point of view, that doesn't make sense. So one of the things we need to understand, for example, in my state of Arizona, is we really need to understand what's happening in Mexico and Australia and other parts of the world where our goods are traded, either imported or exported. The second point is that if we're trying to understand food systems, producer prices, input prices are now all set in a global economy, and farmers are responding to prices, not climate. So we need to understand climate change affecting global food prices, not just how it will affect them in a particular place. And I would argue that the assessments do not represent these connections well. They tend to focus on crop yields, although IPCC did try to move more into food systems, but we're not spending enough time looking at economics, trade, or consumers. And we very much need to look at supply chain analysis to understand local vulnerability, and I know some other people will talk about that. And we also need to then look at adaptation in a global context and not just locally, because adaptation in other places can make us less vulnerable. And this was just one example I picked for Brazil, and this shows all of the different parts of the world that Brazil imports goods for. And thus Brazil, in order to understand, even though Brazil is fairly self-sufficient in a lot of things, there are a number of products where there are vulnerabilities that Brazil has to other parts of the world, and we could do this for any country. The second point I want to make is that the assessments tend to focus on climate impacts on natural resources and agriculture, not on industry and services. And the question I would ask in all of the assessments we do and all of the adaptation work that we do is, what about the industry and service sector? Globally, that's 97% of GDP. 97%, and in the US, it's 99% of GDP. So I would argue, and did so in an article in The Atlantic just the other week about IPCC Working Group 2, that we need to spend a lot more time looking at the mining sector, at the manufacturing sector, which would be food, textiles, chemicals, machinery, retail, healthcare, and real estate, because that's what policymakers care about. That's where GDP is being generated, and it's also where people work. Agriculture is only 3% of global GDP, 30% of employment, and most people work in the sectors that we're not looking at in our assessment. So I'd argue that assessments are overlooking climate impacts and adaptation in terms of employment. We have done a little bit on agriculture and tourism workers, but what about people who are losing jobs or gaining jobs in manufacturing and services? Because it links to vulnerability. If you lose your job in these other sectors, you're going to become food insecure, and unemployment is a form of vulnerability. And we also need to look at workers' adaptation. People have looked a little bit at remittances. In northeast Brazil, I know work programs were always used as a way of adapting to drought. So I think I'm going to end just with a point that in order to address these gaps, we shouldn't wait another 4 or 5 years. We need to have sustained assessment processes, at least in the US. And one of the things we're working on right now is how to use the co-production and the energy of all of those people that contributed to the US national assessment to mean that we can keep going with special reports and other reports that address some of these gaps. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. If you were a city manager in Cape Town, it's likely that you would be faced with many challenges, including dealing with one of the first floods that hit our city on Thursday and Friday. As I boarded the airplane, this article was in the paper. Our national elections were on Wednesday, and there were a number of service delivery protests leading up to these national elections. You'd also be trying to address the needs of housing, food, etc., of much of the population, as well as addressing the complaints from many wealthy residents on a number of issues. Even if you had a sense of the importance of addressing climate change while meeting development goals, you might battle to factor it into the other urgent challenges you faced. Hopefully, as the city manager, you would have somebody fighting the climate change battle. And then, as the manager, you might look at the international level and hear that big investors like Buffett last week said that he doesn't think that there's enough understanding of the impacts to factor climate change into decisions. So how do those of us that think that adaptation is critical get it implemented into the operation of cities? How do we move from the world-class science and assessments that we've just heard about to increasing adaptation in practice? I argue that a focus on governance can help identify critical barriers and enablers of adaptation. If the barriers are addressed and the enablers used to their full advantage, there'll be more chance of integrating adaptation into city activities in a way that addresses development needs. What do I mean by governance? I mean, who are the actors that are shaping and managing events? What are their mentalities, their ways of thinking about the problems? How do they interact with other actors? What conflict arises? What are their goals? What are some of the innovative responses already happening? To me, this is what understanding governance is about and what we need to build upon to strengthen future adaptation. There's a growing focus on governance in the adaptation field, and specifically in urban adaptation research. Multi-level governance recognizes that actors at different scales need to be involved in the adaptation process. Historically, the absence of institutional capacity to support climate protection has undermined urban adaptation. A focus on governance can help to identify how institutional capacity can be strengthened. The urban adaptation agenda is relatively new, but there are a number of initiatives that are emerging, although limited examples in practice, particularly in the global south. Many big initiatives are supporting this work on urban adaptation, and an understanding of governance is part of much of this work, but I think that it could be more explicitly addressed. I think a focus on governance helps us as researchers to help surface the voices and learning of those at the coalface. And we need to ensure that these lessons are fed back into the global dialogues, such as the conference that we're at today, at a critical time when emerging approaches can still be informed by lessons from these early initiators. I believe a focus on governance speaks to the first two themes of this conference. If we focus on actors at the city and municipal scale and unpack how they are engaging with adaptation to climate change, it's a good start to understanding the barriers and opportunities to adaptation on the ground. In the Global South, addressing development is a priority, so we need to understand how adaptation to climate change can help to address this goal to get traction in our efforts. And looking at adaptation on the ground surfaces the multitude of challenges, of which climate is just one. This helps to ensure that climate change is contextualized amongst other stresses, which is necessary when aiming for improved well-being. Before getting to two case studies that I want to use to illustrate my point, it's useful to zoom out to the international scale. In an assessment of urban adaptation actions through the Urban Climate Change Research Network Assessment Report on Climate Change in Cities, in the chapter on governing carbon and climate in cities, 3 categories of adaptation were identified: the technological infrastructure responses, the economic and planning instruments, and the institutional responses. And then there are going to be many that fit into the category of other. And this is just one way of breaking it down. There are many other ways, I'm sure, that it could be broken down. Of these 3, I want to focus on the institutional actions and argue that understanding governance can help us to unpack what enables or undermines institutional adaptation actions. Institutional adaptation actions include a number of measures, and very broadly, these might be broken down into the adaptation policy and plans and the sectoral competencies. For the adaptation policies and plans, these are often driven by local government, but what we see is that sometimes there isn't actually national funding to support this. The sectoral competencies include different forms of engagement with different actors in the different sectors, and early warning systems might be one example. If we look at adaptation plans, it's useful to look at Joanne Carmen's work that looked at 468 cities around the world. They contacted over 1,000 cities through the ICLEI network, but 468 responded. And we can see from this that the majority of cities are actually in the early stages where they're planning, they're thinking about it, etc. Only 18% have actually started to implement actions. But this also gives us an opportunity. It means that we need to engage with those who have started to implement and make sure that these lessons are learned and shared with others. So I want to share 2 stories with you today. The first is about adaptation in Cape Town and Durban, the city plans, and the second one is about a specific disaster response in terms of flood risk governance in Cape Town. The first story looks at barriers and enablers to actually developing and implementing adaptation plans in eThekwini municipality, also known as the City of Durban and Cape Town. This work forms a chapter in a book by Glover, Vick and Smith that has just come out electronically and will soon be available in hard copy. The City of Cape Town is on the left and the City of Durban is above. The City of Durban reminds me a lot of Fortaleza actually, both with the weather and the way it's laid out. Cape Town's future climate projections include decreased runoff and decreased water quality. Increased flooding is expected to impact on stormwater systems of informal settlements. In Durban, increased temperatures are expected and increased rainfall, although the latest CMIP 5 results suggest that there's not as much increased rainfall as was expected under CMIP 3. Both these coastal cities have high levels of poverty and inequality that need to be addressed. Both these cities are quite far along in, they've both developed adaptation plans and have started to implement these adaptation plans. I'm sure many of you have read of the work of Durban, and it is featured again in the IPCC latest report. So I can't talk about all the barriers that emerged from understanding how they've implemented adaptation plans, but I just want to focus on 2. The first one is both a barrier and an enabler. So mentalities, or the way the problem is viewed, can be both a barrier and an enabler, as we see in this case. The actors who are implementing the adaptation plans see adaptation as a development issue. They've come to see it as this and see it fundamentally as a development issue. However, many other people still see it as an environmental issue. And what this has meant is that it's been sidelined to environmental departments sometimes, and somebody will deal with it in the environment department. And I think many of us know that this is not the case because it has to be addressed holistically. So in Durban, there has been a bit of a shift to view it more as an environmental issue beyond just the leaders in it, and as a development issue. And this happened because of a number of reasons. So there were many extreme events in Durban that helped garner the support for the policies related to managing impacts. These included a big storm event along the coast in 2007, rainstorms that then damaged properties in 2008, and 2 tornadoes that wrecked 2 informal settlements. These extreme events assisted in getting politicians and senior officials to understand the dynamics of the problem that included both environmental and developmental impacts. Another anecdote that one of the politicians mentioned is that during apartheid, he saw environmental issues very much as something that white people were concerned about. The environment was for the wealthy. And so he didn't think that climate change should be prioritized in local politics because he needed to address development issues. However, after these storm events, he realized that houses were damaged, people's incomes and livelihoods were affected, and he really saw it then as a developmental issue. Unfortunately, these extreme events haven't been as frequent since then, and so that momentum has been lost. So I think we need to focus on how we can ensure that it is understood as a development issue. The second barrier I want to talk about is mandate. In both cities, Cape Town and Durban, the climate function at the local level is not structurally based and not acknowledged. Where adaptation is happening is because people have shown leadership on the issue due to their personal convictions rather than a policy mandate. Because of that, if those people disappear, then much of the climate change work might fizzle out. Although luckily, this institutionalization of policies and plans means that it'll hopefully stay around longer. When the study was conducted, the municipality of eThekwini was running at 50% staffing capacity with tight budgets and urgent development priorities. This inhibits the likelihood of proactive risk reduction, as short-term development needs are prioritized rather than planning for long-term events. So in South Africa, support for adaptation at the city level requires changing mandates, and this often needs to be accompanied by shifting financial regulations, which requires a number of experts in the political and legal field to be involved. It requires us trying to change the framing of climate change to a development issue, which includes a number of skills that we could draw on from social, psychological, etc. And it means we need to ensure that people understand that adaptation projects are just a small part of adaptation. It's about a process, it's about learning. The second story I want to share is from an IDRC DFID-funded project looking at managing flood risk governance in Cape Town. Flood risk is an annual problem. You saw the picture at the beginning, and it happens every year. In 2013, it was particularly bad, with 40 out of 150,000 households experiencing flooding. And I just want to read from this book, Rising Waters, here, that we worked with some journalists at the end of our project to pull together some of the stories of people living with flood risk to try and capture some of the messages. So I'll be reading from this article that you see. Fighting for health and healing. Tears well up in Bomkazi Sokaya's eyes. She speaks of being stuck with no choice but to live with sewage-tainted water seeping through the corner of her tiny bedroom. Her home in Kosovo borders a road that has become a cesspool of liquid waste. When the water stands outside, I get these things. She points to scars from blisters that develop on her skin when the dirty water level rises. When I go to the clinic, they give me treatment, but once back near the water, they just start again. It's terrible. Bomkazi and her neighbor, Nokopumla, share a small yard that floods every winter. Both are unemployed, desperate for work, and battling with coughs that worsen as Cape Town's wet, cold winter approaches. Some local political tussling has resulted in the portable toilets not being emptied, leaving many residents to use buckets as toilets, which they empty into standing water near Bomkazi's home each morning. She is not only affected physically by this, but it hurts her dignity, and she expresses shock that people would do that, knowing that she and others live right there. She stuffs old clothes and sturdy material into the corner where it oozes through her room to stifle the smell and the wet. But she feels helpless to solve the problem. For now, she can only manage it. And so it's not an easy story for people like Bomkazi, and yes, people are doing many things to cope with flood risk. But to really address the problem of flood risk, we need to take a much more holistic approach, and it needs to address activities at the city level. In the Cape Flats, the informal settlement where Bomkazi lives, a large area, there are over 300 informal settlements that are located in low-lying wetland areas with high water tables and sandy soils. And so rising flooding happens in winter. Many of the informal settlements are on private land, and so government can't provide many of the services they would like to. Much of this problem is because people live in shacks, but unfortunately building formal houses has its challenges as well and is slow. A promising institutional response exists in Cape Town, the Flood and Storms Task Team. This task team brings together different departments in the city to plan for and respond to annual flooding. Our project took an explicit governance focus to unpack how collaborative governance might be better supported. Part of this entailed trying to understand how different actors view the problem and are responding to it. Although there's an intention to collaborate, both between departments and with intermediaries, more could be done. But an enabling factor is that all departments acknowledge that something needs to be done. This is actually quite an important start, which is not insignificant when you start to unpack some of the mentalities of the different city departments that take a more technocratic approach to reducing flood risk. However, capacity to engage was a barrier. Because of the skills needed to facilitate a delicate engagement with leaders in informal settlements who disillusioned with service delivery, and because officials first need to fulfill their primary mandate, which they often don't see as engagement with local stakeholders. So our work focused on building a platform for collaborative dialogue that brought together residents of Philippi, one of the informal settlements, local government, ward councillors, and intermediaries. As university researchers, we were in a unique position to be able to do this. This had success in some ways, but unfortunately failed in others. But we did learn that collaborative governance is a very challenging process, and we think that many of the actors saw the value in this and the potential for it, and new relationships were built, but it is an ongoing effort that needs to be maintained. Both of these stories benefited from trying to unpack who the actors were, how they were trying to exert influence on events, and how they were interacting with others, whether using a formal governance lens, as we did in the flooding work, or using the lens of barriers to adaptation in relation to implementing institutional adaptation. Our understanding of the problem helped to target adaptation more specifically. I would argue that the examples I've shown and other work unpacking governance that I'm sure many of you in this audience are involved in can speak directly to a number of points that emerged in the IPCC Urban Areas report. I've just picked out 3 of them for today. The first one is about adaptation providing opportunities for incremental and transformative development. However, I think the subtext is useful to look at, where it says that although the opportunities are high, there's limited evidence of this being realized in practice. So we need to capture these places where it is happening and share them more broadly. Secondly, building human and institutional capacity in local governments is critical. And I think our flood work showed how important it is to take a governance lens to understand how we can build this capacity more, understand where actors are coming from and what is their starting point so that we can move forward together. And thirdly, the capacity of low-income groups and vulnerable communities need to come together with local government. And I think an understanding of governance helps to understand what is happening already, what are the views of these different actors, what are the power dynamics, how are they being recognized, and how are they not being recognized. So I think that we can also draw on the emerging barriers to adaptation literature to support this work for using governance as a foundation upon which to build urban adaptation. Some of the work I've been involved in calls for new areas of research and action to be supported. In a paper that we wrote reviewing barriers to adaptation across Africa, we saw that there actually is quite limited work on the social and the institutional dimensions of barriers to adaptation. Social justice, I think, also needs to become more of a focus if we're truly to meet the needs of low-income and vulnerable groups. So in conclusion, addressing barriers to adaptation is key to achieving more systematic adaptation that is not just focused on projects, but on an institutional environment that is supportive of integrating climate knowledge and acting in a timely, flexible, and holistic manner. A focus on governance helps to support a focus on process, a process through which goals are defined and pursued collectively, with government being one of the actors in this process, but recognizing the importance of other actors. And so I'd like to close by saying that if I was the city manager of Cape Town, I'd be more persuaded to prioritize urban adaptation to climate change if I could see what the links to development were. and if I could draw on an interdisciplinary team that could help unpack the barriers to adaptation that I might face. Thank you very much. And I have a last slide that mentions some research opportunities coming up at the University of Cape Town linked to this work.
Okay, people, we're going to take one, maximum two short questions, please. Cynthia?
Thank you for the presentations. Here's my question. What's the balance between research and assessment? I think the researchers are being a little bit assessed to death. I don't think we just need to start on another set of assessments. I think we need real, and I think it's very germane that we have this discussion here at PROVIA, which is at the PROVIA conference, which is focused on research on vulnerability impacts and adaptation. If we don't get our act together and really bear down on some of these very critical issues, just such as Gina was bringing up on the urban side, for example, just starting another assessment right away, I don't think is what we need to do. And I think we need to persuade our national funders of research to fund research on adaptation worldwide. I think that's what we really need to go forward. So comments and thoughts from the panel. Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions? Yes?
We have in the States a hugely divided governance system. We have internationally a hugely divided governance system. And we have at the urban level, where I've been working, very, very fragmented, very evolving institutions, particularly in the secondary cities that are growing so quickly. So how do we aggregate it?
I'll just start by saying it's a huge challenge, and I don't think there's a clear path forward. I think the bright spots are the places where innovative experiences are occurring. New York City with the work that Cynthia is doing, some of the stuff that's happening in Durban. I think that basically what we need to do is start assembling archive of experiences. We need to be researching those experiences, as Cynthia has outlined, and really build up a confidence level so that, city leaders, regional leaders, national leaders feel like they have the level of confidence necessary to start deploying some of the examples that have worked. But it's a really big lift, a really, really big lift that this community needs to take some leadership on.
I would just raise the question about whether disaggregated or fragmented governance is always bad. I think we need to understand under what conditions it might be better because it's more democratic or you don't have the higher levels constraining the lower levels. So I'd question the assumption, and it's a researchable topic.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I think what we're seeing is there are a lot of innovative examples that are kind of coming under the radar. But I think this idea of pulling together what is happening and how is really important. And I think sometimes academic papers that us as academics are kind of forced to write aren't necessarily the best way to do it. So there are a lot of lessons that need to be shared that capture the richness and the challenges that people have faced and how they've been overcome. So finding a way to do that, I think, is going to be really important.
Any other question? Cecilia?
Cecilia Conde from Mexico. Gina, perhaps I misunderstood, but you said climate change was drift from looking at it as an environmental problem to development problem. And I think in my country that would be sort of dangerous. We want to have, yes, development, but in the context of looking at environmental issues. So we don't want to separate development from environmental problems. So perhaps I misunderstood, but I want to make what we think about adapting actions.
So I don't think development excludes environment. So that is what I'm trying to argue. But I think that if you just say it's an environmental problem, a lot of people say then it's not something I need to deal with. So in our country, I think when it's viewed as a development problem, it means it has to be part of all different sectors. It has to be taken holistically, part of our national development plan that includes environment and many other factors. Sustainable development. Yes.
Sorry, one last question by Salim.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to share something and then ask a question of Diana in particular, and perhaps Chris. Just a few days ago in Nepal, we had a big conference, over 400 people from all over the world working at community-based level. These are people working with the most vulnerable communities on community-based adaptation. I think one or two people might even be here who were in Nepal at that meeting. The point I'm making is there's a lot of stuff happening in developing countries. We heard Cape Town and Durban as an example. As the US develops its adaptation plan, I think the US has a lot to learn from the South on how to organize themselves as society. And I think there's an opportunity here for South to North learning, and not the presumption that it's always going to be the other way around. Any comments?
Well, again, yes, of course. I think that is a little bit of an uphill struggle in Washington, because even trying to get an international component into the national climate assessment or into America's climate choices, where we tried to make those arguments that we have a lot to learn from the rest of the world. I've found, particularly in working on the agricultural chapter, that because federal agencies' jobs are tied to America being great, that they don't really want to admit that they have things to learn from other countries. But, and given my accent, if I say that, it's particularly offensive, even though I'm an American citizen. But I think you're right, particularly on community-based adaptation, there's a lot to learn. And I hope that if we do US assessments in an international context, that we can do it from your perspective. I think it's really important. And to be honest, I mean, a lot of the things that were used in the national assessment, the conceptual or theoretical ideas, are from other parts of the world. They weren't from the US, particularly sort of on the approaches to understanding risk and adaptation.
And I just want to close with a couple of thoughts about the role of assessment. In some ways, this is response both to Cynthia's question and to Salim's. There are lots of different kinds of values that are contributed by assessments at different scales. IPCC has this unique level of government buy-in. It can take things on an international way, but it doesn't have the traction at the local or the regional scale that a national scale assessment does. A microphone might have died. So there really are lots and lots of reasons to be involved in assessment, and lots of different kinds of values from having a multiplicity of assessments that are occurring and even are occurring at different times. I think that there's been a little bit of confusion in the public's minds about recent assessments from the Royal Society, from the U.S. National Academy, from the AAAS, from the IPCC, from the National Climate Assessment. But at least for me, what I'm seeing is transition from a pulse of attention to the climate issue to a more of a sustained dialogue that involves not only the scientific community, but the policy community and the media as well. And I think it's going to be essential that that continue. And that's where a lot of the value of assessments comes. I think that we all have a huge amount of research to do, but there's a real value in focusing that research into the dialogues where it can be part of this sustained assessment. And I'd encourage everybody to continue to be involved in assessments, recognizing that they're not the whole enterprise, but they're a key part of the enterprise. Thanks very much.
Well, people, we have to wrap it up now. I'm sorry. You can talk with our 3 stars here during coffee break or dinner or lunch or dinner or whatever you want to. Well, I thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and please, those interested can remain for those 2 side events. Thank you.